March 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The desert wind howled across the dunes, carrying sand and the smell of fuel. The Americans were new to the war, green, untested, facing Rommel's veterans, men who'd survived Africa since the beginning. The Germans expected another easy victory. Their Panzers outgunned the Shermans. Their gunners were faster, their tactics sharper. Every advantage seemed theirs. But then something changed. In the confusion of battle, German tank commanders began to notice something strange. The Americans weren't hesitating. They were moving together, turning together, firing in perfect rhythm. When one Sherman stopped, another took its place. When a German flanked right, the entire American line shifted with uncanny speed, as if one mind controlled them all. The Germans couldn't understand it. Their own radio chatter was a mess. Distorted AM transmissions filled with static and interference. Orders were repeated, delayed, or lost entirely in the noise. To change formation meant sending a runner or a signal flare. But the Americans? They reacted instantly. At first, the Germans assumed it was luck, or some pre-planned formation. Then they realized the truth. The Americans were talking to each other. Every Sherman tank, from the platoon leader to the last in line, carried a radio, and not just any radio. It was a new kind of communication system that none of the German forces had ever seen before. While the Wehrmacht still relied on fragile AM signals that cracked and faded in the desert heat, the Americans had something different. FM radios, a revolution born not in a laboratory, but in an American garage. To the Germans, it looked like witchcraft. To the Americans, it was just another piece of gear. As the battle raged, German units tried to regroup, to flank the Americans like they always had. But before they could move, American tanks were already reacting. When one Panzer was spotted, the call went out instantly, a calm voice over static-free airwaves, relaying position and direction. Within seconds, Shermans shifted to intercept. It was speed of thought turned into movement, a network of steel connected by invisible threads. Rommel's men began to realize they weren't fighting just tanks. They were fighting a system. Every American tank was a set of eyes, every radio a heartbeat, every command relayed across miles with perfect clarity. The difference wasn't just technology, it was philosophy. The Germans built tanks like weapons. The Americans built tanks like teams. That day, under the Tunisian sun, the Panzers struck hard, and the Shermans took their losses. But the Germans couldn't break them. Every time a tank went down, another took its role without confusion or delay. Coordination, not armor, held the line. When the smoke cleared, the field was littered with wrecks on both sides. But for the first time, Rommel's veterans had felt something unexpected: confusion. They'd faced British discipline, French stubbornness, and Russian ferocity. But never before had they faced an army that moved like one machine. Thousands of engines, each listening to the same invisible signal. The Germans had the better tanks. The Americans had the better connection. It didn't end the battle that day. Kasserine was still a hard lesson. But it was the beginning of something the Germans couldn't stop. Because as the Allies learned to fight, they learned faster. And the secret was already spreading across every front, every tank, every soldier that carried a radio made not for power, but for clarity. What began as a whisper in the desert would soon become the sound of victory across continents. In the years to come, it would define how wars were fought, and how one army, built on communication, coordination, and sheer production, would beat the greatest mechanized force Europe had ever built. Because in the end, it wasn't the biggest gun that decided the battle, it was the clearest voice. Before the first Sherman ever rolled onto a battlefield, the war for communication had already begun. In factories, workshops, and laboratories, thousands of miles from the front. In 1940, while Europe burned and America was still debating its role in the conflict, a small team of engineers at Motorola was working on something that would quietly change warfare forever. Their names weren't generals or strategists. They were engineers. Daniel E. Noble, Enric Magnuski, and their team. Men who understood circuits better than tactics, but who saw one truth clearer than anyone else. In the next war, whoever could talk faster would win faster. They were developing FM radio, frequency modulation, a technology that replaced the unstable, noisy AM transmissions used by every army in the world. It was clear, stable, and nearly immune to interference. Even when surrounded by engine noise, gunfire, or atmospheric static, FM signals cut through clean. At first, the Army wasn't interested. Tank radios were considered secondary. Weight, range, and armor mattered more than talking, but Noble's team persisted. They built prototypes out of car parts, tested them in trucks, then in tanks. They proved that their new radios could send voice messages without the distortions that had plagued AM for decades. The SCR-508 became the first truly reliable tank radio in the world. It was small, rugged, and could send clear voice transmissions up to 20 miles, even in motion, even under fire. When the first units were issued to Sherman crews, no one realized what they were holding. But in the field, it became obvious. German tank commanders relied on AM sets that could barely reach a few kilometers. Their signals broke apart in bad weather, mountains, or cities, and only the platoon leader had a working radio. The rest of the tanks followed flags or hand gestures. If that commander was hit, the formation collapsed into chaos. The Americans had no such weakness. Every Sherman had a radio. Every commander, gunner, and loader could hear the same voice, the same orders, the same updates. It meant that even in the smoke and dust, American units moved like parts of one machine. Tank platoons no longer waited for instructions. They acted, reacted, and coordinated instantly. In Italy, this difference became impossible to ignore. During the brutal fighting near Cassino, German troops watched in disbelief as American columns maneuvered through narrow mountain passes, reversing, flanking, and covering one another without visible signals. From the outside, it looked rehearsed, but it wasn't. It was communication. The radios gave the Americans something far more powerful than better sound. They gave them situational awareness. When one Sherman spotted an enemy position, it didn't have to retreat to report it. It just spoke. Within seconds, artillery adjusted. Infantry advanced. Another platoon flanked. Every soldier, every gun, every tank became part of a single conversation, a battlefield connected by invisible threads. That was something no German doctrine had prepared for. The Wehrmacht was still fighting the last war, where tanks operated like isolated fists, directed from above. The Americans were fighting the next one, where tanks were neurons in a living brain. Even when outgunned, the Shermans could adapt faster, recover faster, and strike faster. If a Panther appeared on the ridge, the call went out. Contact left, 400 yards, armor! Instantly, 3 other Shermans adjusted their aim, infantry dropped for cover, and anti-tank guns swiveled in unison. To the Germans, it looked like impossible coordination. To the Americans, it was just another day with a working radio. But it wasn't just tactical, it was cultural. German commanders distrusted initiative. Orders came from the top, and deviation was punished. American crews, on the other hand, were encouraged to act, to think, to improvise, to use their radios as extensions of instinct. When combined, that mindset and technology became unstoppable. By 1943, Motorola's production lines were building more radios in a month than Germany had built in the entire war. Tank radios, infantry walkie-talkies, air coordination units, all feeding into a growing network that tied the battlefield together. It was quiet, invisible, and relentless. No one wrote songs about it, no one put it in headlines, but it changed everything. Because every time an American tank turned left instead of waiting to die, or called in artillery seconds before impact, it wasn't luck. It was the sound of frequency modulation, the pulse of an army that could think aloud. And as that invisible web spread across North Africa and into Europe, the Germans began to sense something they couldn't quite define. They weren't just being beaten by tanks or men. They were being beaten by organization, by an enemy that could react before they even finished their own orders. The battlefield was no longer about who saw first. It was about who spoke first, and who could make thousands of voices move as one. By 1943, the tide had turned. The Shermans that rolled into Italy were no longer the inexperienced machines that had stumbled through Tunisia. They were part of a living network, a mobile, connected force that fought as one organism. In the mountains near Cassino, German defenses were brutal. Concrete bunkers hidden in cliffs, machine guns dug into the rocks, and artillery that could pin down an entire battalion. But the Americans brought something the Germans couldn't see, a voice that never stopped talking. At dawn, the sound of tank engines echoed through the valleys. The lead Shermans moved slowly, their radios alive with chatter. Reports flowed constantly, infantry positions, enemy fire, terrain conditions. The company commander didn't need to wait for scouts or signal flares. He was already hearing everything in real time. When a forward tank spotted a Panzer hull-down across a ravine, it called the sighting in seconds. Panzer, 200 yards, left ridge. The message spread instantly through the platoon net. Two Shermans shifted to cover the flank while another called for artillery. Minutes later, shells landed with surgical precision, not guessed, but guided by radio corrections. The Panzer never fired a shot. For the Germans, this was maddening. Their communications were still locked in the past. One radio per platoon, often short range, often lost to interference. If a command tank was hit, the rest of the formation was blind. They couldn't adapt fast enough, couldn't coordinate across terrain that cut sightlines and muffled sound. To them, the American coordination seemed supernatural. Tank crews appeared where they shouldn't be. Artillery landed exactly where they moved. Every German maneuver seemed to meet an American response before it began. The secret wasn't magic. It was clarity. The FM radio network turned the chaos of battle into something organized, almost mechanical. Even when terrain blocked vision, the air carried orders and updates. A Sherman hidden behind a church wall could still direct fire for units half a mile away. Infantry, artillery, and armor all shared the same frequency family, a common language in the storm. In Sicily, the pattern repeated. When German forces tried to retreat through the narrow mountain passes near Troina, the Americans coordinated an attack entirely by radio. Shermans blocking escape routes, infantry sweeping through the valleys, and artillery sealing off the exits. The Germans never saw the trap forming. By the time they realized, the roads were blocked, and the radios on the American side were already calling in the next phase. Every battle became faster, cleaner, deadlier. The Shermans no longer needed to be superior in armor or firepower. They were superior in rhythm. It was war fought at the speed of sound. That advantage reached its peak in the hedgerows of Normandy, where visibility was measured in yards and chaos reigned. Sherman crews learned to move in near silence, speaking only in short, precise bursts over the net. Left clear. Hold fire. Shift right. 2 o'clock. German tank commanders had to climb half out of their hatches to shout to neighboring vehicles. A single bullet or shell fragment could silence a unit's coordination. But the Americans, they never stopped talking. That constant connection built trust. Crews began to think not as individuals, but as parts of one machine. If one tank was hit, others already knew where to move, how to cover, how to strike back. The Shermans weren't faster on paper, but they were faster in reaction. And in tank combat, reaction meant survival. When Allied radio intelligence began monitoring captured frequencies, they found something striking. German tank crews were trying to copy American tactics. Calling faster, coordinating more often, But their technology couldn't keep up. Static, overlapping transmissions and short ranges crippled them. In one intercepted message, a frustrated German officer shouted over the net, "They always know where we are before we do." He was right. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy, the American Army was the most connected force in history. Not just tanks. Every division, every platoon, every aircraft overhead shared one synchronized rhythm. The battlefield was no longer a mess of isolated fights. It was a single organism, moving, adapting, and responding with speed that stunned the enemy. The Germans had better tanks, but the Americans had better timing. Every battle, every advance, every sudden pivot on the field came from the same invisible edge. The hum of radio frequencies, the sound of coordination. By the time they reached France's open plains, German commanders began to dread that sound. The clear, calm American voices cutting through the static, calling out targets, adjusting artillery, shifting armor lines. It meant one thing: the enemy was already in control. By late 1944, the American advantage was no longer just in weapons or numbers. It was in information. Every tank, every artillery gun, every infantry unit was connected by an invisible web of signals that stretched from the front lines all the way back to command posts miles away. It wasn't just a battlefield anymore. It was a network. Factories in Michigan and Illinois were producing not only tanks and jeeps, but thousands of radios every week. Motorola's engineers had refined the designs into near perfection. Waterproof housings, compact vacuum tubes, and rugged tuning dials that could survive mud, shock, and shell fire. The SCR-508 and SCR-528 sets became standard across every Sherman battalion, and every replacement tank rolled out of production already wired for voice command. While the Germans still built each Panzer as a masterpiece, the Americans treated the Sherman like a tool, simple, functional, and replaceable. The real weapon wasn't the steel, it was the signal. Each armored company had its own net, each battalion connected through a higher frequency. Artillery, air support, engineers, all tuned into linked networks that could shift focus in minutes. If a bridge collapsed, engineers heard it live. If enemy armor appeared, tank destroyers were moving before the coordinates finished transmitting. The German army, with its strict chains of command, couldn't compete with that tempo. Their officers relied on field phones and couriers, methods that had barely changed since 1918. By the time a German report reached headquarters, the situation it described was already obsolete. But the Americans were living in the present tense, speaking the battle into existence as it happened. In Lorraine and the Ardennes, that advantage became decisive. When fog grounded aircraft and artillery lost visibility, the radio network filled the gap. Sherman commanders called fire missions blind, adjusting aim based on the voices of infantry who could see muzzle flashes through the trees. Tanks leapfrogged forward under constant communication, their movements so synchronized that German prisoners later said it looked choreographed. The speed was staggering. An American tank platoon could detect, identify, and engage a target in under 2 minutes. A German formation could take 10. That difference meant everything. But it wasn't just efficiency. It was culture. American industry treated communication as logistics. Each new radio was tested, packed, and shipped with standardized manuals so that any crew anywhere could replace a damaged set in hours. There were spare parts, replacement tubes, batteries, even mobile repair teams that followed armored divisions, swapping burned-out units in the field. The Germans couldn't match that rhythm. Their advanced optics and armor were useless when orders came too late. They fought in fragments. The Americans fought as a single living organism, an army wired together by sound. At night, the network hummed quietly across Europe. You could stand in the dark near a Sherman column and hear it. Faint voices through the static, Coordinates, bearings, call signs. Thousands of men, unseen, talking to each other through the fog. Every voice clear, confident, connected. It was the heartbeat of modern war, and it didn't stop with tanks. Airborne units carried the SCR-300, the first backpack FM radio, nicknamed the walkie-talkie. Artillery units had the SCR-610, linking fire direction directly to frontline observers. Even fighter pilots received relay signals from ground units, coordinating attacks in real time. What had started as an experiment in a factory was now the nervous system of the entire Allied force. German commanders began to notice something chilling. Whenever American armor appeared, artillery followed almost immediately. Whenever they shifted positions, airstrikes arrived within minutes. The Allies were reacting faster than thought possible, as if they knew the German plan before it began. In truth, it wasn't foresight, it was feedback. The Americans had built the first feedback loop of war, constant communication creating constant adaptation. The enemy was always one step behind because the Americans were already talking about the next move. A German officer captured near Metz described it simply: they moved like one body. When we hit one arm, the other was already closing. That was the power of their network, the fusion of technology, production, and philosophy. While Germany worshipped design perfection, America mastered connection. The war was no longer about whose tank could hit harder. It was about whose army could think faster. And by 1944, the answer was clear. The Sherman's armor might have been thin, its gun outclassed by the Panzer's 75mm, but it carried something far more dangerous. A voice, a clear, calm, unbroken voice that could move mountains of steel with a single word. In September 1944, near the French town of Haraucourt, the myth of German armored superiority finally met its breaking point. It was foggy that morning, the kind of heavy, damp mist that swallowed whole battalions. Visibility barely stretched beyond a few hundred yards. The fields around Lorraine were quiet until the sound of engines broke through. German Panthers, more than 80 of them, advanced through the haze. Their armor was thick, their guns precise, their confidence absolute. They had beaten the Soviets, burned through France, and believed no American tank could stand against them. Waiting for them in the fog were Shermans of the 4th Armored Division, supported by tank destroyers from the 704th Battalion, the same men who had hunted Panthers in Lorraine weeks earlier. Outnumbered, outgunned, and almost blind, they faced an enemy 3 times their strength. But this time, the Americans had something the Germans didn't. They could see through the fog, not with their eyes, but with their voices. Inside each Sherman, the FM radios crackled to life. Tank commanders reported movement. Recon units relayed bearings. Artillery batteries listened in. Every few seconds, another voice joined the chorus. Panther sighted, North Ridge. Sherman 3 advancing to intercept. Artillery, fire for effect, grid 027. The fog turned the battlefield into chaos for the Germans. They couldn't see their allies. They couldn't hear them. Their AM radios hissed with static, cutting out in the damp air. Tank commanders shouted from their hatches, waving flags that vanished into the mist. But the Americans never stopped talking. In the space of minutes, scattered Sherman platoons became a coordinated ambush. Artillery adjusted fire by voice. Tank destroyers repositioned based on live updates. Every move, every pivot, every shot, coordinated by invisible command. When the Panthers fired, their shells struck empty ground. The Shermans were already moving. When the fog cleared briefly, the Germans found themselves flanked. American fire came from every direction, every voice calling out new ranges, new targets. The battle raged for 2 days. By the end, the Germans had lost nearly every tank they sent forward. The Americans lost fewer than 30. The difference wasn't steel, it was sound. Captured reports later showed the confusion on the German side. Commanders wrote of losing contact with their own units, of tanks firing at friendly vehicles, of orders that never arrived. Meanwhile, American records read like a conversation. Short, calm, methodical. Every man knew where his comrades were, what they were facing, and when to strike. It wasn't just a victory, it was a revelation. The Battle of Aricourt proved that command, communication, and adaptability could defeat armor, precision, and fear. For the first time, the Wehrmacht, the army that had perfected mechanized warfare, was beaten at its own game by a force that simply talked faster. From that point on, the pattern never changed. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, the same rhythm followed. The Shermans moved in harmony with artillery and infantry. When bridges fell, engineers were already on their way. When planes were needed, air controllers called them before the request reached headquarters. Germany's army still fought with courage, but not with connection. And in a modern war, that was fatal. By the time the Allies reached the Rhine, even German officers admitted the truth. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, reflecting after the war, said, "You had the best coordination we ever faced. You could afford to lose tanks because you never lost communication." That was the hidden power of the Sherman. Not its armor or its gun, but its network. Every tank was part of a system that thought, reacted, and evolved faster than any single commander could control. The Germans had believed war belonged to those who built the best machines. The Americans proved it belonged to those who used them best. When the last battles ended and the guns fell silent, the lesson was undeniable. Technology had changed the battlefield forever. Not the kind measured in caliber or horsepower, but the invisible one carried through radio waves and human voices. Because the truth of the Sherman wasn't that it was indestructible. It wasn't. The truth was that it could adapt. It could move, respond, and stay connected no matter how the battlefield changed. That's what beat the German Panzers. Not power, communication, not armor, coordination, and not luck, but 1,000 calm voices speaking clearly through the fog of war. The Germans never expected to lose to the Sherman. But in the end, it wasn't just tanks that defeated them. It was a signal, invisible, unstoppable, and everywhere at once. The sound of modern war had arrived.